Hi students, welcome to another session of Film Studies. We are at Module 3, Unit 2. So last unit was all about the ideologies in cinema. We talked also about national cinema. For this unit, we are going to look at national cinema a little more extensively, especially from the Indian context. And then we look at fourth cinema. Now, to briefly tell you something about fourth cinema before we proceed. So, I mentioned earlier that Stephen Crofts had mentioned about three types of films from a national perspective. He talked about the first cinema and second cinema and third cinema. And we also know what first cinema is all about, how Hollywood centric it is. And the second cinema, which is the director cinema, it's all about auteurs and it is all about the European auteur cinema. And third cinema is mostly from the third world countries, which is about post-colonial cinema mostly. But later, we have realized that there is another world, another form of cinema, another kind of cinema, which has been totally ignored in this context. And that is the fourth cinema. What is this fourth cinema all about? It is the cinema that is produced, which is made by people from the indigenous communities. People from the indigenous communities across the world. Of course, I don't think they should be called, I don't think it should be called fourth cinema actually, because it is a very important and a very significant repository of films. But I'm glad it is getting due recognition. So, fourth cinema basically looks at the whole world of the indigenous communities from their own perspective. We'll come to that later. So first, let's go back to national cinema. So last session, I mentioned about national cinema. I talked about the idea of homogeneity. I talked about how national cinema strives to create a homogeneous identity for its people. And cinema helps in this process of sort of homogenizing its people, sort of trying to bring some unity between the people, sort of use tropes like flags and the soldier and so on. So national cinema strives for this kind of, it has an ideology. The ideology, it's very simple. It is about understanding the nation. It is about feeling that sense of oneness. It is about connecting with the nation. Now, the problem here is that when you talk about nation, there are certain dominant discourses in a nation at any point in time. These dominant discourses, as I mentioned earlier, becomes very significant in the filmmaking process. So when you talk about cinema, we also talk about the dominant ideologies at any point in time. I hope you remember that. So when you talk about national cinema, the same thing applies. It is the dominant ideology in a society, in a nation, that sort of drives the way in which cinema is also conceived and imagined. So cinematic narratives will tell you the story, will try to emphasize upon the dominant ideologies. So as I mentioned in the last session, if you look at early Indian cinema, it was all about the welfare state, the idea of the welfare state. It was about the nation. It was about the governments providing all sorts of facilities for its people. It was a dream. It was an imagination that was shared by the people of the nation at that point in time. There was a lot of optimism there. Now, as time moved, this also shifted. The paradigms shifted over time. As nation progressed, the dominant ideologies kept changing. Now, another interesting factor was national cinema has always created another, right? So this sense of nationhood, as one understands a nation, is reflected in the films as well. So you have films which talked about, for example, the middle class. Now, if you look at the films of the 70s and early 80s from Bombay, a lot of films which had people like Amol Palekar and Deepthi Naval and all of those people, or Zarina Wahab, those films had a very interesting kind of story to say. So this was a kind of middle cinema which catered to the or addressed the imagination of the middle class, especially in Bombay. There are songs which talk about those people, because these films talked about housing, the problem with finding a housing. There are films which talk about Bombay of those times, where there's a huge real estate sort of shift that was happening. So there are films where people dream about possessing their own homes. So simple middle class dreams became material for very beautiful movies. So the films of those kind, especially the middle cinema, looked at these concerns of the middle class. So this was the nation. This was what constituted the nation then. This was an interesting trope that you would see in these films. So similarly, you have films about the laboring class. A lot of films that talk about the laboring class, or look at the way rural India was portrayed. So this was a time when people were, sort of trying to find their space in this new India. And as time progressed, this kept changing as well. I'm trying to sort of contextualize the idea of national cinema within India. Now, we often think about the popular Hindi cinema when we talk about Indian cinema. But look at all the regional languages and how did they imagine the nation? Now, when you talk about regional cinema, it is not just about the larger Indian identity. Take, for example, Malayalam cinema. Now, in Malayalam cinema, Indianness is not always about the larger India. It is not always about the nation per se. It is also about being a person, a Malayali. It is also about being a person from Kerala. So it is about Onam, it is about the temple ponds, it is about what we very specifically understand as being a Malayali, or as we call it now, being a Mallu. Or you look at Kashmir, you read about the Kashmiriyat. So Kashmiriyat is not about being an Indian. It is about that very specific regional identity, which is also something that reminds you of your Indianness. So regional identities are also portrayed or understood as part of the nation in those films. There was no larger Indianness as such when it comes to regional cinema. So if you look at Malayalam films, for example, and you try to understand this idea of the nation, you would see that it is often about very regional festivals. It is about wearing clothes that reminds you of being a Malayali. It is not about, because if you talk about the larger Indianness and your clothes, you cannot actually connect, right? So we try to understand Indianness in different ways. It's not a single monolithic entity at all in any of these films. Now, another dimension is this whole question of othering. As I mentioned right in the beginning, in the previous session, Birth of a Nation is about building another. So when you create another, you immediately try to consolidate your strength against the other. Now, India has very interesting examples of this as well. There has always been attempts to create the other. So in India, it was sometimes Pakistan, it was sometimes China, especially when there were wars going on with these countries. So you have characters, soldiers who fight wars, soldiers who, give up their lives for the country. So the other was somebody from outside. But in recent times, the other is identified as the Muslim. At some time in between, especially I think Roja would be a film that I would like to mention here. Roja was probably the first film which looked at the Muslim as the other, especially the Kashmiri Muslim as the other. So you create a very homogeneous identity, which right now, after the 1990s, you sort of started creating this homogeneous Indian as the Hindu Indian, especially the Savarna male, to be more precise. So you have a Savarna heterosexual male as this ideal Indian as of now. So in recent times, this is something that we constantly see. So there are several films that I can quote here, but I would ask you to take a look at these films and try to understand them. So Roja has this very interesting scene which tells you about the identity of this other and how you try to consolidate power, consolidate this idea of this ideal Indian. Now, take a look at the films in recent times and understand this whole dynamics that is at play. So nationalism can sometimes also be a kind of inclusion. It can be a trope for inclusion. Films like Garam Hawa, which was released in 1973, or films, a lot of those films during those times actually talked about such concerns. They tried to, if you remember the last scene of Garam Hawa, you would know how this is a very interesting trope. The way in which the film looks at the Muslim community, trying to sort of bring them into the community, becomes very interesting. So, as I mentioned earlier, in contemporary times, this sort of othering has become much more prominent. A lot of films looks at the community, especially the Muslim community, as the other, and tries to sort of create villains out of them, and tries to look at them as people who work against the nation. You could probably say that this sort of started with, as I mentioned earlier, Roja, where Kashmir became a trope. And it has continued after this. With economic liberalization, as I already said, the way in which nation began to get identified also began to change. Economic liberalization opened up markets, and it also opened up a large space among the diaspora. Consumption of Hindi cinema, especially popular Hindi cinema especially, was increased manifold. So we have films which which have diaspora population, and which talks about, I hope you remember this film, Shah Rukh Khan film, where you have Kuch Kuch Hota Hai, where you have the protagonist asking the character of Rani Mukherjee about being Indian. And she sings this, bhajan, and talks about how she's still an Indian, although she has been abroad for a very long time. So this idea of Indianness became a very important trope in these films, especially post 1990s. So there's been a lot of conversation around this Indianness. There's a lot of conversation about being of a nationalist, talking about being proud of India. And the way in which war films have proliferated in recent times is also an indication of this interest. Or the way in which the celebratory tone that you hear in a lot of films, that is also. So music also becomes a very important trope in these films to bring about an idea of national cinema. So every single film talks to the idea of a nationhood. What is expected of the Indian, what is expected of its people, is something that you can see. I have used India here mostly because we are more familiar with the idea of Indianness. We are more familiar with the tropes that we use to talk about nationalism. If you look at the US, the Hollywood industry, you would see that war films have played a significant role in creating a national identity as well. over a period of time. So when the country was at war with Vietnam, the films were all about the Vietnam War. And then you would see how the Muslim became the other after the 9/11 attack. So the Muslim became the other, the Muslim identity, sort of became the other, where a national pride was created or developed out of this whole trope of the other, of the Muslim other. So any nation you can actually look at closely, and you will see this kind of a conversation developing all the time. So jingoism became more popular only much later. It was probably towards the new millennium, after the beginning of the new millennium, that you see a lot of jingoism, hyper nationalism developing as part of this nationalist agenda. You can take a look at those films again and try to understand how it functions in society. Now, moving on to fourth cinema. Fourth cinema is a very interesting idea. Now, what is fourth cinema? As I already mentioned this, fourth cinema is cinema from the indigenous communities. Now, it was Barclay, who is from the Maori community of New Zealand, who first put up this idea of the fourth cinema. And fourth cinema is usually films created by the indigenous communities and talks about the community. There's a very interesting example from Kerala actually. Have you heard of Leela Santosh? Leela Santosh comes from a tribal community in Kerala and makes films. She had some time back tried to crowdsource for a movie of her own, but you will also find other films by her, short films especially by her, on YouTube. You can check out. Now, when you talk about fourth cinema, it is very interesting to note how the concerns of this community are, kind of similar across the world. One very striking concern that you see in these films is, of course, ecological concerns. Most of these films show the fear for the future, the concern for the future because of the way in which we are destroying the planet. So these films try to look at the indigenous communities. They try to understand their worldview. They try to present their worldview. They try to focus on the spiritual connection that they build with the world around them. And they try to focus on their own people. They try to use their own language in their films. Now, the question of agency should also be asked here. And since these people come from the community, these filmmakers do come from the community, they are the best people, the best creative persons to talk about their lives, talk about their experiences. So there are a lot of films coming out from India as well of this kind. So I would like to just use one interesting quote by Barclay. He says, I quote, this is 1990 when he said this, "How can we take this maverick yet fond friend of ours, the camera, into the Maori community and be confident it will act with dignity?" I hope you remember what I said in the beginning, that the camera is always ideological. Camera always represents the ideology of the dominant the discourse at any point in time. It's a very ideological technology, or it's a very ideological product. So using the camera, how do we bring some dignity to the community? How can we expect this dignity? Probably it can only be by producing more films from within the community. So he talks about the indigenous gaze. It's a very interesting word. He talks about the indigenous gaze and the indigenous audience. It is time that we started looking at the community through their own eyes, using films produced and directed by their own community. Of course, you need money, you need capital for that, and indigenous communities require that sort of capital. So fourth cinema is definitely there, especially from Australia and Canada, but we also need more films from India, which we right now don't have. There are attempts, especially from Northeast and Central India. There are films, there are documentaries, but if you are going to look at the lives of the indigenous communities, make sure you are watching documentaries and fictional narratives created by members from the community. Try not to look at those works created by other people, because they are either going to exoticize them or going to victimize them. What we need is more proper authentic eyes, and fourth cinema sort of provides that. So we have been discussing about national cinema, and we have been discussing about fourth cinema. So fourth cinema is an extension of this whole concept. Fourth cinema also is part of national cinema, although it was an idea that was developed much later. So just to briefly sum up everything that we have been talking about, national cinema works in different ways, and it tries to sort of help in some way, help nation building. The way in which cinema acts in this form, is through different ways, but ultimately it tells you how ideologically shaped it is and how it keeps changing over time with shifts in the hegemonic ideologies that govern a nation at any point in time. Please keep doing the reading and watching of films. That's the only way in which you can improve your understanding of these concepts. Thank you.